Hello, and welcome to this presentation on grief and loss called Good Grief. Before we started, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Sarah DeRoche. I'm the Program Director at Gilda's Club Simcoe Muskoka. I've included a little picture of me and my puppy Sunday. I have a master's degree in social work from the University of Toronto, and I've also included my email here so that you can email me with any follow-up questions after the presentation. So let's start right at the beginning. What is grief? Grief is the experience of someone who has lost a loved one to death. It is comprised of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and physiological changes that can vary in intensity over time. Grief can also be applied to non-death related losses. For example, the loss of a breast after mastectomy, the loss of an ability or a career due to cancer, and even pre-grieving the loss of your own life or someone else's life after a terminal diagnosis. And we'll touch on this more later. I really like this image that I've included here because it really encapsulates how isolating grief can be and how grief can really change our perception of reality. So here we see a girl and she's on a planet all by herself, and everyone else on Earth is saying we're all happy and totally fine. So what is normal grief? I really like this quote by Gordon Alpert that says, "Each person's grief is like all other people's grief. Each person's grief is like some other people's grief. And each person's grief is like no other people's grief." This really encapsulates the concept that there is no such thing as normal grief. And in fact, I've included the word normal here in quotations. However, there are some typical characteristics of grief. You may experience some, all, or none of these. Somatic distress. This just means physical or bodily pain. Preoccupation with the image of the deceased. This could include always having to look at pictures of them or even thinking that you're seeing them on the street or out and about. Guilt relating to the deceased or the circumstances of their death. Hostile reactions, agitation, short fuses, impatience, or even anger. And the inability to function as one had before the loss. This can include things like short-term memory loss, fatigue, etc. Let's talk about the difference of grief and depression. The DSM-5, which is a diagnostic tool used by doctors and mental health professionals, does not define bereavement as a diagnosable disorder. Yet typical signs of grief, such as social withdrawal, can mimic those of depression. So how can one tell the difference between grief and depression? Grief is typically preceded by a loss or death. Depression can happen at any time without a trigger. The sadness present in grief is related to the loss or death directly. Depression, on the other hand, is characterized by a general sense of worthlessness, despair, and a lack of joy, again without any obvious trigger. The symptoms of grief may improve on their own with time. Someone with depression often needs treatment, such as counseling and/or medication, to recover. Despite their differences, depression and grief are not mutually exclusive. If someone is vulnerable to depression, grief has the potential to trigger a depressive episode. If someone already has depression, their condition may prolong or worsen the grieving process. Now let's talk about a few different types of grief. The first is disenfranchised grief. This type of grief can interfere with the bereavement process. If society does not recognize a loss, the person may have trouble accepting it themselves. They may try to repress or deny their emotions. Shame and secrecy can make the symptoms of grief more severe. There are 5 main types of disenfranchised grief. The first is when society devalues the loss. For example, the loss of a pet often garners less sympathy than the loss of a human relative. Others may say, "It was just an animal," or "You can adopt another dog," and accuse the person of being too emotional. However, research shows that the mourning period for a pet is about the same length as that for a human family member. The second type of disenfranchised grief is when the loss is ambiguous. An adopted child, for example, may grieve the loss of their birth parents, even if the birth parents are still alive. If a loved one has late-stage dementia, family members may feel as if the person they knew is gone. This can also include grief over the loss of one part of your body or your identity. The third type is when society stigmatizes the circumstances of the loss. Pregnancy-related loss, for example, is often considered taboo. Women who undergo a miscarriage may feel guilt and shame, and they may avoid telling others about the loss to avoid being blamed. The fourth is when society does not recognize the person's relationship to the deceased. A coworker or friend may mourn someone who died, but they will likely receive less support than a family member, for example. The same is true for ex-spouses, even though they used to be family. The fifth type of disenfranchised grief is when others do not consider the person capable of grief. For example, when young children experience loss, adults may misinterpret signs of bereavement. They may believe the child is not capable of understanding the loss or having prolonged feelings about it. People who have cognitive impairments or intellectual disabilities may also have this type of disenfranchised grief. If your grief is disenfranchised, it is important to claim the legitimacy of the grief for yourself and seek professional support or find a support group specific to your type of grief. I quickly want to touch on something called prolonged grief disorder. This is also sometimes known as complicated grief disorder. Studies are inconsistent with the prevalence of this type of grief. Some say less than 10% of those who are bereaved end up with prolonged grief disorder, and some say up to 20%. Because it is not in the DSM-5, there are differing opinions on how long someone needs to be bereaved in order to qualify for prolonged grief disorder. However, most sources agree on 1 to 5 years. Whereas chronic depression is characterized by a broad loss of interest and an inability to imagine any sort of pleasure, those with prolonged grief disorder experienced prolonged interest in the deceased and believe that reunion with the deceased would bring satisfaction. Here are the diagnostic criteria for prolonged grief disorder. There are also lots of quick tests you can take online if you do some Googling. However, if you think that this could be you, I strongly encourage you to reach out to your family doctor or another trusted health or mental health professional. Another type of grief is anticipatory grief. This is the anticipation of loss and death from a physical illness, either for yourself or for somebody else. This type of grief is characterized by uncertainty, and it can be extremely disorienting. One key way to deal with anticipatory grief is through open communication through all friends and family members. This includes talking about end-of-life wishes, such as wills, estates, what you want your funeral to look like, what you want to be done with your possessions once you die, etc. One common misconception about grief is that it is a feeling. This is false. Grief is an experience that can include an array of emotions. Take a look at these common feelings that are often experienced during grief. Do any of them surprise you? Do any of them confuse you? Let's talk about a couple of these now. Sadness is often the most common feeling found in the bereaved. It is not necessarily manifested by crying, but it often is. Not allowing sadness to be experienced, be it with tears or without, can lead to complicated grief or heightened sensations of sadness. I've included this quote here from Megan Devine, who is one of my all-time favorite speakers on grief, because I feel it really encapsulates the sadness that is felt during the bereavement process. I've often heard that grief is just love that has nowhere to go. And to me, this is a perfect picture of what sadness and grief looks like. Anger can be one of the most confusing feelings in the grieving process. Anger can be directed at the individual for dying, at the source of the death, for example, at the cancer, or if your loved one was murdered, being angry at the person who killed them, or even at others whom had no impact or influence on the death or loss. Anger comes from two main sources. The first is a sense of frustration that there was nothing you could do to prevent the death. The second is a regressive experience that occurs after the loss of someone else. This includes feeling unable to exist without them. Anxiety has two main sources. The first is an attachment-related anxiety. This is a fear that the survivor will not be able to take care of themselves without the person who died. The second is an increase on the personal awareness of your own mortality that can sometimes happen after you see someone else die. I wanted to quickly touch on the concept of dialects. A dialect is two seemingly opposing things that coexist. For example, being desperately sad because someone you love died, and experiencing joy and laughter from a funny show on TV. Neither negates or diminishes the strength and the truth of the other. Often in grief, we experience several seemingly opposing emotions at the same time. So, for example, someone may be grieving but also feel relief at the death of the person for a variety of reasons. They may think to themselves that feeling relief means that their grief is less real, or even that they're doing grief wrong. However, dialects teach us that the human emotional experience is much more complex, and that we are fully able to experience several different emotions at the same time, with all of them being true. So in that example, that person may know that they feel relief and grief, and both in that moment are real. So why do we grieve when it is such a painful process? The state of mourning is a state of healing. Just as a body needs to heal after being badly burnt, one's psyche, mind, or soul, whatever language you use, needs to heal after a significant loss. Grieving honors how important and significant the person, place, thing, or relationship was to you. It reminds us that that was something that was very valuable. Grief builds a memorial for the person who died or the thing that you lost. Grief helps us find a way to remember the deceased while embarking on the rest of our journey in life. And grief can make us more aware of our personal strengths. It forces us to adapt and take on new tasks or challenges that you never would have before the loss. As the name of this workshop suggests, grief can be good, even though it is extremely painful. It is possible to have a good grief journey. One model shows that there are 4 tasks to accomplish through grief in order to prevent complications later on. These tasks are not linear, and you can go through them again and again until you feel resolution. So for example, someone might complete task 3 and then move on to task 2, and then to task 4, back to task 2 again, then to task 1, and then to task 4 again. These are not boxes to be ticked off. However, these are things that you can do in order to achieve some sort of sense of accomplishment or feeling like you're doing something to help yourself.